In 1801, a Scottish captain with 54 sailors and 14 tiny guns sailed straight at a Spanish warship carrying 319 men and 32 cannons. He flew a false American flag to get close. He locked his mast into the enemy rigging so their guns could not angle down far enough to hit his deck. He ordered his men to blacken their faces like pirates before boarding, and in just over an hour, he captured the entire ship. The Spanish second-in-command was so humiliated that he asked the Scottish captain for a written certificate proving he had fought bravely. The captain obliged, writing that the officer had conducted himself like a true Spaniard. That Scottish captain was Thomas Cochrane. Napoleon called him the Sea Wolf. The British press called him a hero. He was, by almost every measure, the most gifted naval commander of his generation. That was 1801. By 1814, the British government had thrown him in prison, stripped him of every honor, and kicked his banner down the steps of Westminster Abbey. Cochrane's gift for making enemies on the ocean was only matched by his gift for making enemies in Parliament, and both of those habits would cost him everything he had built. But what happened after his disgrace is the part of the story that sounds completely made up, because Thomas Cochrane did not quietly disappear. He sailed across the Atlantic and helped liberate 3 entire countries. This is how it happened. Thomas Cochrane was born in 1775 at Ansfield, near Hamilton in Scotland. His family had an impressive name and almost no money left to go with it. His father, the 9th Earl of Dundonald, was an inventor who burned through the family fortune trying to develop a process for protecting ship hulls with coal tar pitch. The experiments did not pay off. By 1793, the family estate had been sold to cover debts. Cochrane grew up surrounded by the trappings of aristocracy, but with the bank account of a tenant farmer, which, looking back, explains a lot about the chip on his shoulder. His uncle, Captain Alexander Cochrane, got him into the Royal Navy through the standard backdoor method of the era. Starting when Thomas was 5 years old, his name was written into the crew logs of 4 different warships he never actually set foot on. This practice was illegal, but common. It let well-connected young men pile up years of technical service before they ever touched a rope, which meant faster promotion when they finally showed up. Cochrane officially joined the Navy in 1793 at the age of 17, serving aboard his uncle's ship HMS Hind. Over the next several years, he bounced between ships in the Mediterranean. He passed his lieutenant's examination in 1796. He got court-martialed in 1798 for disrespecting a superior officer. The board found him not guilty, but told him to watch his attitude. If you are keeping score, this was the very first sign of a pattern that would define his entire career. Thomas Cochrane could outfight and outthink almost anyone at sea. He could also make an enemy out of a brick wall. In February of 1800, Cochrane got his first real break. He was put in charge of the prize crew sailing the captured French battleship Genereux back to the British base at Port Mahon in Minorca. The voyage was brutal. A violent storm nearly sank the ship, and Cochrane and his brother Archibald had to climb the mainmast alone in the middle of the gale to reef the sails before they were torn apart. For getting the ship home in one piece, he was promoted to commander and given his own vessel. That vessel was HMS Speedy, a brig sloop stationed out of Port Mahon. The Speedy was, to put it gently, not an impressive warship. She carried 14 4-pounder guns, which were so small that Cochrane once walked the quarterdeck with the entire broadside, all 7 cannonballs, sitting in his coat pockets. Her crew was about 90 men on paper, though Cochrane often sailed with far fewer because prize crews kept being sent off on captured ships. To give you a sense of just how small this ship was, Cochrane was over 6 feet tall, and when he stood below decks, he could not straighten up without hitting his head on the ceiling. He had to shave with his face poked through the skylight because there was no room in his cabin. His superiors probably gave him the Speedy, hoping he would fade into the background of routine patrol duty. They did not know Thomas Cochrane very well. Over the next 14 months, Cochrane turned the Speedy into a terror of the Western Mediterranean. He captured, burned, or ran ashore 53 enemy vessels. he seized 122 guns and took 534 prisoners. He developed an entire playbook of deception and cunning that reads more like a spy novel than a naval log. On one occasion, a much larger Spanish warship cornered him. Cochrane flew a Danish flag and had his quartermaster, who actually was Danish, lean over the rail in a Danish naval uniform and shout that the ship had just come from Algiers, where the plague was raging. The Spanish boarding party heard the word quarantine and backed off immediately. The Speedy slipped away in the dark. On another night, he was being chased by an enemy frigate that was tracking the Speedy by the glow of her lantern. Cochrane tied a candle to a floating barrel, set it adrift, and let the frigate follow the decoy light while he sailed off in the opposite direction. But the stunt that made him famous across all of Europe was the capture of El Gamo on the 6th of May, 1801. The El Gamo was a Spanish xebec frigate carrying 32 guns, including 24-pounder carronades that could throw more than 7 times the weight of shot that the Speedy's little 4-pounders could manage. She had 319 men. Cochrane had 54. Instead of running, Cochrane sailed directly at her. He flew American colors to buy time, got close enough that the Spanish gunners could not depress their cannons low enough to hit the Speedy's hull, and locked his rigging into theirs. His crew fired upward through the Spanish decks with double and triple loaded shot. The first broadside killed the Spanish captain and the boatswain. 3 times the Spanish tried to board the Speedy. Each time, Cochrane pulled back, just far enough to rake the massed boarding party with grape shot, then closed in again. When he finally decided to board the El Gamo, he split his remaining crew into 2 groups. One party, led by his brother Archibald, attacked from the bow with their faces blackened to look like Barbary corsairs. The second party came over the stern. The Spanish crew, rattled by the appearance of what looked like a pirate boarding party, hesitated just long enough for Cochrane's men to fight their way across the deck. Meanwhile, the Speedy was crewed by exactly 1 person. The ship's surgeon, alone on the entire vessel, shouted commands to imaginary sailors below deck to make the Spanish think reinforcements were coming. Cochrane ordered the Spanish flag torn down. The remaining crew, thinking their own officers had surrendered, stopped fighting. 3 British sailors died. 14 Spaniards were killed and 41 wounded. The total Spanish casualties exceeded the Speedy's entire crew. Cochrane was promoted to post captain, and no, the Admiralty did not reward him with the captured El Gamo. They sold her to Algiers as a merchant ship, which meant Cochrane received almost nothing in prize money for one of the most spectacular single-ship actions in naval history. He was furious. This was the Admiralty's way of reminding him that talent did not excuse attitude. His luck turned slightly in 1804 when he was given command of the 32-gun frigate HMS Pallas. On her maiden cruise near the Azores, Cochrane captured 3 Spanish merchant ships and a 14-gun privateer, pocketing over £75,000 in prize money. He later took command of the 38-gun frigate HMS Imperios, a faster and more capable warship. His midshipman on the Imperios was a young officer named Frederick Marryat, who would later become one of the first novelists of the Age of Sail, writing stories directly based on what he watched Cochrane do. During 1808, Cochrane and a Spanish guerrilla force captured the fortress of Mongat, which controlled the coastal road between the cities of Girona and Barcelona. He raided French and Spanish positions along the entire Mediterranean coast, pioneering a style of amphibious hit-and-run warfare that kept far larger forces tied down trying to catch him. The Spanish nicknamed him El Diablo. The French called him the Sea Wolf. Everyone who fought alongside him respected his planning and his courage. Everyone who served above him wanted to strangle him, but Cochrane was about to walk into a fight he could not win with cannons. In 1806, Cochrane was elected to Parliament as a member for Honiton in Devon. His first election was a lesson in how British politics worked at the time. Honiton was a notoriously corrupt borough where votes were openly bought and sold. Cochrane won the seat but refused to pay the customary bribes to voters after the election, and they promptly voted him out at the next opportunity. He then won the far more prestigious seat of Westminster, where the electorate was large enough that bribery was impractical, and he held it for over a decade. In Parliament, Cochrane went after the Admiralty with the same intensity he had once aimed at enemy frigates. He exposed the practice of appointing officers based on connections rather than ability. He attacked the system of naval prize courts, which skimmed money from the sailors who actually fought the battles. He called out specific admirals by name for incompetence and accused the government of mismanaging the war against France. He was not diplomatic about any of it. He had no allies in the Tory government and no interest in making any. The establishment took notice, and they did not appreciate it. Then came the Battle of Basque Roads in April of 1809, and this is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. A squadron of French warships was anchored in a heavily defended bay near the port of Rochefort on the Atlantic coast of France. The Admiralty needed someone to lead a fireship attack to break up the anchorage, and despite all their differences, they knew Cochrane was the best man for the job. He was recalled from shore leave and given command of the operation. Cochrane did not just send in ordinary fireships, he designed explosion vessels, essentially floating bombs packed with barrels of gunpowder, hundreds of grenades, and thousands of pounds of combustible material. These were towed into the French anchorage at night. When the first explosion ship detonated, the blast was massive. The entire French fleet panicked. Captains cut their anchor cables to escape. Ships collided with each other. All but 2 of the French warships were driven hard aground on the mudflats. Cochrane signaled Admiral Gambier that the enemy fleet was helpless and begged him to send in the main British squadron to finish the job. Gambier, who was anchored safely miles away and reportedly spending his time reading religious pamphlets, refused. He delayed for hours. By the time any support arrived, several French ships had floated free on the rising tide and escaped. The opportunity for a complete annihilation of the French fleet, a victory that could have shortened the war, slipped away. Cochrane was furious. He publicly accused Gambier of cowardice and tried to block a vote of thanks to Gambier in Parliament. Gambier demanded a court-martial to clear his name, and the Admiralty obliged. The court-martial acquitted Gambier, and Cochrane's naval career in Britain was effectively over. He would not receive another sea command. If Cochrane had stopped here, this would be a very different story. He did not stop. While sitting in Parliament with no ship to command, Cochrane continued his campaign against corruption and waste. He was loud, abrasive, and effective. He also made the single worst social connection of his life. Among his associates was a man named Captain Random de Beringer, a Prussian adventurer who had been trying to get passage to America. De Beringer was also connected to Cochrane's uncle, Andrew Cochrane Johnston, and to Cochrane's financial advisor, Richard Butt. These were the people who would drag Cochrane into the catastrophe that nearly ended him permanently. On the morning of February 21st, 1814, a man calling himself Colonel Dubourg arrived at the Ship Inn in Dover wearing a military uniform. He claimed to be an aide to Lord Cathcart, the British ambassador to Russia. He brought staggering news. Napoleon was dead, killed by Cossacks. The Bourbon monarchy had been restored. He demanded the news be sent to London by semaphore telegraph immediately, and then he hired a coach toward the capital, stopping at inns along the way to spread the word. At the same time, 3 men dressed in Bourbon military uniforms appeared on the streets of London, loudly celebrating the fall of Napoleon. The London Stock Exchange reacted exactly the way you would expect. Government bond prices shot upward. Traders scrambled to buy. The price of government securities surged by 20% in a matter of hours. Then, the truth came out. Napoleon was very much alive. The whole thing was a hoax. And when the Stock Exchange Committee investigated, they found that more than £1.1 million worth of government bonds had been sold on the day of the hoax, most of it purchased the previous week. 8 people were charged. Among them was Thomas Cochrane. The evidence against Cochrane was entirely circumstantial. De Beringer, who turned out to be the fake Colonel Dubourg, had visited Cochrane's house on the morning of the fraud. Cochrane said de Beringer came to ask about passage aboard his new naval command, HMS Tonnant. Cochrane had also made investments in government securities that increased in value during the hoax. He insisted these investments were made with prize money from his earlier naval captures and had nothing to do with the fraud. The trial was held on June 8, 1814, before Lord Ellenborough in the Court of King's Bench. Ellenborough was a high Tory with a documented history of hostility toward radical politicians. He had previously sent the radical journalists William Cobbett and Henry Hunt to prison. The defense asked for Cochrane to be tried separately from the obviously guilty co-conspirators, so his case would not be poisoned by the evidence against them. The request was denied. One of the central pieces of evidence was the color of the uniform de Berenger was wearing when he arrived at Cochrane's house. The prosecution argued it was the scarlet military uniform of the fake Colonel Dubourg, proving Cochrane knew exactly who de Berenger was pretending to be. Cochrane and his servants testified that de Berenger had been wearing a green sharpshooter's uniform under a dark greatcoat, and that he had simply come to discuss travel arrangements. Cochrane had provided a sworn affidavit before the trial explaining this, and his servants confirmed it. But the affidavit also mentioned a detail about de Berenger changing clothes, which the prosecution seized on as suspicious. The prosecution presented evidence for 13 straight hours. When they finished at 10 at night, the defense expected the court to adjourn until morning. Instead, Ellenborough ordered the defense to begin immediately. The defense lawyers objected multiple times. Ellenborough overruled them. They presented their case until after 3 in the morning. Ellenborough then adjourned and reconvened at 10 the same morning for summation. After the verdict came down, Cochrane's lawyers found several new witnesses who were willing to testify that de Berenger had indeed arrived wearing a green uniform, not a red one. Ellenborough refused to hear the new evidence, ruling it inadmissible because 2 of the other defendants had already fled the country. The jury deliberated for 2.5 hours and returned a guilty verdict against all defendants. Cochrane was sentenced to 12 months in prison, fined £1,000, and ordered to stand in the pillory outside the Royal Exchange for 1 hour. The pillory sentence was quietly dropped. The government feared that Cochrane's supporters would riot if their hero was publicly humiliated in a wooden frame. The public subscribed money to pay his fine. His constituency re-elected him to Parliament while he sat in prison. But the damage was done. The Admiralty stripped him of his naval rank. He was expelled from the Order of the Bath, and his banner was torn from the chapel at Westminster Abbey and kicked down the steps. He was expelled from Parliament by a vote of 144 to 44. The man Napoleon called the Sea Wolf had been destroyed, not by an enemy fleet, but by his own government. 3 Lord Chancellors would later review the trial and conclude that Cochrane should have been found not guilty based on the evidence presented. 2 major historians who studied the case in the 20th century, Christopher Lloyd and David Cordingley, concluded he was innocent. The question of who actually masterminded the fraud has never been definitively answered. If you are finding this useful, consider hitting subscribe. This channel covers stories like this every week. So, Cochrane was disgraced, unemployed, and sitting in a London house with a ruined reputation. But what he did next made everything that came before look like a warm-up exercise. In 1817, Cochrane placed a notice in a London newspaper advertising his availability to serve in the navies of newly independent nations. A representative of the Chilean government came knocking. Chile was fighting its war of independence from Spain and desperately needed someone who knew how to win at sea. Cochrane arrived in Valparaiso in November of 1818 with his wife Catherine and their 2 children. He was appointed Vice Admiral of the Chilean Navy. The fleet he inherited was small, poorly equipped, and undermanned. Some of the ships leaked. The sailors were a mixture of Chilean volunteers, foreign mercenaries, and men who had never been to sea before. The Spanish forces in South America, by contrast, were entrenched, well supplied, and backed by the fortified ports and garrisons that had controlled the Pacific coast for 3 centuries. But Cochrane was Cochrane. In 1820, he led one of the most audacious military operations in South American history. The target was the Spanish fortress complex at Valdivia, a system of interconnected fortifications guarding the mouth of the Valdivia River in southern Chile. The Spanish considered it the strongest defensive position on the Pacific coast. It had multiple forts, heavy artillery, and a garrison that outnumbered Cochrane's available force. The Chilean government told him not to attack. His own officers told him not to attack. Cochrane attacked anyway, landing 300 Chilean Marines and soldiers under covering fire from his ships, storming the outer fortifications one by one, and using the captured guns of each fort to bombard the next. Within 48 hours, the entire complex had fallen. The Spanish garrison that survived either surrendered or fled inland. Later that same year, he pulled off another stunt that sealed his legend in the southern hemisphere. The Spanish flagship Esmeralda was anchored in the fortified port of Callao in Peru, protected by shore batteries, a chain boom across the harbor entrance, and the guns of 27 warships and armed merchantmen. The harbor was considered untouchable. Cochrane looked at it and saw an opportunity. On the night of November 5, 1820, Cochrane led a cutting-out expedition. 240 sailors in 14 small boats rowed silently into the harbor under the cover of darkness, slipped past the guard boats, and boarded the Esmeralda from multiple sides simultaneously. The fighting was vicious and close quarters. Cochrane himself was wounded during the boarding, hit by a musket ball that shattered a bone in his right hand. He kept fighting. Within 20 minutes, the Spanish flagship was in Chilean hands. The shore batteries opened fire on their own captured ship, but Cochrane's men cut the anchor cables and sailed the Esmeralda out of the harbor under fire. The seizure of the flagship effectively crippled Spanish naval power on the Pacific coast. Chile and Peru owed a significant portion of their independence to this man who had been thrown out of the British Navy 6 years earlier. From Chile, Cochrane moved on to Brazil. The young Brazilian Empire was fighting to break free from Portuguese control. Cochrane was appointed First Admiral of the Brazilian Navy, and he did not disappoint. When the Portuguese garrison at Bahia refused to surrender, Cochrane blockaded the harbor and then pursued the retreating Portuguese fleet across the Atlantic. He captured the fortress at Maranhão through an extraordinary campaign of bluff, arriving with a small force and convincing the Portuguese garrison that a massive fleet was right behind him. They surrendered without a fight. The Emperor of Brazil made him Marquess of Maranhão in gratitude. After Brazil, Cochrane sailed back to Europe and took command of the Greek navy during the Greek War of Independence against the Ottoman Empire. His time in Greece was less successful than his South American campaigns, partly because the Greek factions could not stop fighting each other long enough to fight the Ottomans, and partly because a steamship he had ordered from England arrived too late to be useful. But his presence lent international credibility to the Greek cause at a critical moment. Meanwhile, back in Britain, public opinion had never stopped supporting Cochrane. In 1830, King George IV died. He was succeeded by William IV, a former naval officer who was sympathetic to Cochrane's situation. The Tory government that had prosecuted Cochrane fell and was replaced by a Whig government that included several of Cochrane's allies. In 1832, following a meeting of the Privy Council, Cochrane received a royal pardon and was restored to the Navy list with a promotion to Rear Admiral. 15 years later, in 1847, Queen Victoria personally intervened to restore his knighthood as a Knight Grand Cross of the Order of the Bath. Cochrane spent his later years the same way he had spent his earlier ones, pushing against the limits of what was considered possible. He became an early advocate of steam-powered warships at a time when the Admiralty still believed sailing ships were the future. He designed a rotary steam engine and proposed hull forms that anticipated developments decades later. The Admiralty agreed to build a prototype vessel, HMS Janus, based on his designs, but the technology was ahead of the available engineering, and the ship failed during testing. He also developed detailed plans for what he called his secret war plan, a scheme for chemical warfare using sulfur gas that he first proposed in 1812. The proposal was reviewed by a committee that included the Prince Regent and was rejected on the grounds that it was too inhumane to be used by a civilized nation. The plans were sealed and classified for decades. He was promoted to Admiral and eventually to Rear Admiral of the United Kingdom. He died on October 31st, 1860, at the age of 84, in his home in London. His funeral at Westminster Abbey was attended by representatives from Chile, Brazil, Peru, and Greece, the four nations whose independence he had helped secure. His grave in the central nave carries their coats of arms alongside his own. The banner that had been torn from the abbey and kicked down the steps was restored the day before his funeral. In 1877, a parliamentary select committee reviewed his case and declared that his treatment since the pardon amounted to nothing less than a public recognition of his innocence. His grandson later received £40,000 from the British government as compensation. Cochrane's life inspired more fictional characters than probably any other sailor in history. C.S. Forrester modelled Horatio Hornblower on him. Patrick O'Brien based Jack Aubrey on him. The character Russell Crowe played in the film Master and Commander. Frederick Marryat, who had served as his midshipman and watched him fight firsthand, wrote some of the earliest naval adventure novels based directly on Cochrane's exploits. What survived Thomas Cochrane was not just a string of victories or a list of ships captured. It was the proof that a government can destroy a man's reputation, strip his rank, and throw him in a cell, and still not be able to kill the thing that made him dangerous in the first place. 4 countries carry his name on memorials and warships. His enemies are footnotes. His banner hangs in Westminster Abbey, right where it belongs. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the forgotten figures who shaped history. Drop a comment and let us know which historical figure you think deserves their own episode.